Nobody in the crowded streets of Lagos would have guessed that the quiet man driving a faded yellow Keke was worth billions. Every morning, Daniel Carter wore the same washed-out shirt, slipped on a pair of worn sandals, and joined hundreds of other Keke drivers fighting through traffic, heat, and impatient passengers. To everyone around him, Daniel was just another struggling young man trying to survive. But that was exactly what he wanted them to believe. Only 3 months earlier, Daniel had been living in a mansion surrounded by luxury cars, private security, and people who laughed at every joke he made, whether it was funny or not. At 32, he had inherited and expanded one of the biggest logistics companies in West Africa. His bank account could change a person's life overnight. Yet there was one thing all his money had failed to buy: someone he could trust. After discovering that the woman he planned to marry had secretly been more interested in his wealth than in him, Daniel made a decision everyone around him thought was madness. He disappeared. No expensive watches, no designer clothes, no personal driver. He rented a tiny room in an ordinary neighborhood, bought a second-hand Keke, and created a new identity. For 6 months, he promised himself he would live as a man with almost nothing. And if he met someone who cared about him during that time, he would finally know the feeling was real. For weeks, nothing happened. Then, one rainy evening, a young woman named Emily entered his Keke. She was carrying 2 bags of groceries and shielding a little girl from the rain with her handbag. When Daniel told her the transport fare, she counted the few notes in her purse and quietly realized she did not have enough. Before she could step out, Daniel told her to sit. "You can pay another day." Emily stared at him suspiciously. "Why would you trust someone you do know?" Daniel smiled. "Maybe because somebody has to." That simple conversation changed everything. Emily began using Daniel's Keke regularly. She never treated him like he was beneath her. Some days she bought him food. Other days she defended him when rude passengers insulted him. And when Daniel once pretended he was struggling to pay his rent, Emily offered him part of the small savings she had been keeping for herself. For the first time in years, Daniel began believing he had finally found someone who valued his heart instead of his bank account. But there was something Daniel did not know. Emily was hiding a secret too. And one afternoon, while Daniel was waiting outside a roadside market, a black SUV stopped beside his Keke. The door opened. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, stared directly at Daniel, and called him by the billionaire name he had spent months trying to hide. Emily was standing only a few feet away. Her shopping bag slipped from her hand. Daniel froze, but the expression on Emily's face was not surprise. It was fear. Why was Emily frightened when Daniel's true identity was exposed? Had she known who he really was all along? What secret had she been hiding from him? And why would the mysterious man in the black SUV risk destroying Daniel's entire plan? Most importantly, was Daniel actually testing Emily? Or had Emily been testing him from the very beginning? Before we uncover the truth, kindly subscribe and turn on the notification bell if you believe genuine love should be measured by character, loyalty, and compassion rather than wealth or social status. Stories like this remind us that appearances can deceive, but the way people treat others when they believe nobody important is watching often reveals who they truly are. Subscribe now, because what Daniel was about to discover would completely change the meaning of the test he thought he had created. The man beside the black SUV was Daniel's longtime attorney and family advisor, Michael Harris. For almost 15 years, Michael had been present at nearly every major turning point in Daniel's life. He had stood quietly beside Daniel's father during board meetings, handled complicated negotiations when Daniel was still learning the business, and attended the funeral where Daniel had inherited responsibilities far heavier than anyone outside the Carter family understood. Michael was not someone who appeared unexpectedly. That was what made his presence terrifying. Mr. Carter, Michael repeated. Daniel's fingers tightened around the handlebar of the Keke. He glanced at Emily. Her face had gone pale. Michael noticed her reaction too. For a moment, no one spoke. The sounds of Lagos continued around them as though nothing had happened. Traders called out prices. Horns sounded from impatient drivers. A motorcycle squeezed between two cars. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. But Daniel heard almost none of it. He could only hear those two words. Mr. Carter. Two words that had just torn open the life he had spent months constructing. Michael stepped closer. We need to talk. Daniel's voice hardened. Not here. It cannot wait. Daniel looked toward Emily again. She was still staring at Michael. Not at Daniel. At Michael. And something about that detail unsettled him. If she had simply learned that the poor Keke driver she knew was secretly a billionaire, shouldn't she have been staring at him? Shouldn't there have been confusion? Anger? Disbelief? Instead, she looked at Michael as though she recognized danger. Emily, Daniel said carefully. Her eyes snapped toward him. Yes, you know him. The question hung between them. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. Michael looked at her sharply. That was all the answer Daniel needed. His stomach dropped. You do. Emily slowly shook her head. Daniel, it's complicated. He gave a short, humorless laugh. That's what people say when the truth is worse than the lie. The words came out harsher than he intended. For a second, hurt crossed Emily's face. It reminded him of another face. Another woman. Another lie. And suddenly, Daniel was no longer standing beside a crowded roadside market. He was back inside his mansion almost a year earlier, walking toward the upstairs study with 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. He had been planning a surprise. His former fiancée, Vanessa, had believed he was away at a business dinner. Daniel had cancelled the meeting early because he wanted to tell her personally that he had purchased the lakeside property she had once admired. He remembered smiling as he approached the study. Then he heard Vanessa laughing inside. A man was with her. Daniel had stopped outside the partially open door. You're seriously going to marry him? The man had asked. Vanessa's answer had changed Daniel forever. Of course, do you know what the Carter fortune is worth? The man laughed. And what about love? Vanessa laughed too. Love doesn't buy houses in 3 countries. Daniel had stood there carrying 2 champagne glasses while the future he believed in collapsed behind a wooden door. He never entered the room. He simply returned downstairs, placed the glasses on a table, and called his lawyer. The engagement ended within 48 hours. Vanessa cried. She apologized. She said he misunderstood. Then, when Daniel refused to reconsider, she demanded compensation for the years she claimed she had invested in the relationship. That final demand had hurt less than the conversation behind the study door. Because by then, Daniel understood. What she loved had never been him. Months later, the memory remained like a scar. It was the reason he became a Keke driver. It was the reason he rented a room where the ceiling fan squeaked every night. It was the reason he wore inexpensive clothes and kept his real phone locked inside a safe deposit box. Daniel had designed his strange experiment because he believed poverty could reveal what wealth concealed. Now he wondered whether he had merely created another stage on which people could deceive him. Michael broke the silence. Daniel, the board discovered your location. Daniel's eyes narrowed. How? We believe someone has been following financial movements connected to your private holdings. I haven't touched those accounts. No, but someone else has. Daniel felt a chill. Who? Michael glanced at Emily. She lowered her eyes. Daniel noticed. His chest tightened. What does she have to do with this? Emily stepped forward. Please let me explain. Then explain. She looked around the crowded roadside. Not here. Daniel nearly laughed again. 5 minutes ago, this place had been good enough for the life they supposedly shared. Now suddenly, everyone wanted privacy. Michael opened the rear door of the SUV. Get in. Daniel did not move. His Keke stood behind him, scratched and ordinary. The SUV in front of him was polished enough to reflect the afternoon sun. Two versions of his life. He looked from one to the other. Then at Emily. Are you coming? Emily hesitated. That hesitation frightened him more than anything. Finally, she nodded. Yes. They entered the SUV. Daniel sat opposite Emily while Michael took the seat beside him. The vehicle pulled into traffic. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Daniel studied Emily carefully. He remembered the first week after they met. She had returned to the same junction, carrying the little girl from the rainy evening. The child's name was Sophie. Daniel had assumed she was Emily's daughter. When he jokingly said so, Emily smiled. My sister. Sophie had immediately corrected her. My bossy sister. Emily laughed, and Daniel remembered thinking how rare the sound was. Not because laughter itself was rare. His mansion had always been filled with laughter. At parties, at dinners, around business partners. But he had learned that rich men often lived inside echoes of themselves. People laughed because they wanted approval. Compliments arrived before achievements. Opinions changed depending on who entered the room. Emily's laughter sounded different. She laughed when something was actually funny. And when Daniel told a terrible joke 2 days later, she stared at him for several seconds before saying, "Please never tell that joke again." He had laughed harder than she did. That honesty had attracted him. Now he wondered whether even that had been rehearsed. The SUV stopped at a private office building owned through one of Daniel's holding companies. Michael led them through a rear entrance. Inside a conference room, he locked the door. Daniel remained standing. Start talking. Michael opened a folder. 3 weeks ago, someone accessed archived records related to your father's private investment accounts. Daniel frowned. My father's accounts were closed after probate. Most of them. Most. Michael slid a document across the table. One remained active. Daniel stared at the page. The Carter Foundation Reserve. He had heard the name before, but only once. Years ago, when he was 17, he had overheard his father arguing with someone in the library. Daniel had been halfway down the staircase when his father's voice carried through the hall. That money does not belong to the company. Another voice answered, lower and harder. You're being sentimental. It belongs to the families. Those people signed agreements. They were manipulated. Then silence. Daniel remembered stepping backward before anyone saw him. The next morning, he asked his father about the argument. His father had stared at him for a long moment. Some fortunes are built twice, son. Daniel had frowned. What does that mean? Once when the money is made, and again when you decide what kind of man you're willing to become because of it. At 17, Daniel had not understood. A month later, his father sent him abroad for university. Years passed. The conversation disappeared beneath exams, internships, business expansion, and eventually grief. Now the words returned. The families, Daniel whispered. Michael looked surprised. You remember? Who were they? Michael did not answer immediately. Emily did. My family was one of them. Daniel turned toward her. The room seemed to shrink. Emily sat with both hands clasped tightly together. My father worked for Carter Freight. Daniel's company had once operated under that name before he transformed it into Carter Global Logistics. What was his name? Thomas Reed. Daniel searched his memory. Nothing. Emily noticed. You wouldn't remember him. Try me. He supervised one of the regional warehouses. Daniel shook his head slowly. There were hundreds. I know. Her voice contained no accusation. That somehow made it worse. Emily continued. When I was 12, there was an investigation into missing cargo and fraudulent insurance claims. Several employees were blamed. My father was one of them. Michael looked down at the table. Daniel noticed. You knew about this. Michael exhaled. Some of it. Daniel's anger sharpened. Some. Your father ordered an internal investigation. And the investigation discovered senior executives had been moving losses onto lower-level employees. Your father believed Thomas Reed and several others had been framed. Emily swallowed. My father was fired before the investigation finished. Daniel stared at her. What happened to him? Emily looked toward the window. For a few seconds, she seemed unable to speak. He never recovered from the accusation. She did not need to say more. Her voice carried the weight of years. He had spent his entire life believing his name was the one thing nobody could take from him. Suddenly, people in our neighborhood whispered when he passed. Friends stopped calling. Employers wouldn't hire him because Carter Freight had marked him as dishonest. Daniel felt something twist inside him. Emily continued. My mother took extra jobs. I helped wherever I could. Sophie was still little. Daniel remembered the rainy evening. The groceries. The carefully counted money. The way Emily had insisted she would repay the missing fare. At the time, he thought it was pride. Now he understood it differently. For Emily, owing somebody anything carried history. What did my father do? Daniel asked. Michael answered. He created the reserve. For compensation. Yes, he planned to clear the names of the workers, restore lost wages, and compensate their families. Planned. Michael's expression tightened. He died before everything was completed. Daniel stared at him. His father's death had been sudden. A heart attack during a business trip. Daniel had been 27. He remembered arriving at the hospital too late. He remembered Michael meeting him in the corridor. He remembered asking whether his father had suffered. Michael had told him it was quick. For years, that had been enough. Now Daniel felt an old door opening inside his mind. Why didn't you tell me? Your father left instructions. What instructions? Michael's silence lasted too long. Daniel stepped closer. What instructions? He wanted you to discover the truth when you were ready to act on it, instead of simply reacting to it. Daniel stared in disbelief. You hid this for 5 years because my father wrote some philosophical instruction. It was more complicated. It always is. Emily stood. Daniel. No. He turned toward her. You knew my name before you entered my Keke, didn't you? Emily's eyes filled with regret. Daniel felt the answer before she spoke. Yes. The single word hit harder than he expected. He turned away. The room blurred for a moment. All the mornings, all the conversations, all the meals she brought him. The day she defended him from the businessman who called him useless. The afternoon she offered him her savings. Had all of it been part of some plan? Daniel faced her again. So Vanessa wanted the billionaire. His voice was quiet. And you wanted revenge? No. Then what? I wanted answers. You could have asked. Would Daniel Carter, Billionaire CEO, have spoken to me? Yes. Emily gave him a sad look. No, Daniel, your assistants might have, your lawyers might have, someone from public relations might have sent me a polite letter, but you wouldn't have seen me. Daniel wanted to argue. Then he remembered his old schedule. Meetings planned months ahead. Calls screened by assistants. Unknown visitors stopped at security gates. Letters summarized into bullet points. She might have been right. That realization hurt. Emily continued. I had spent almost 2 years trying to find documents connected to my father's case. Then I learned the Carter Foundation Reserve still existed. After that, I learned you had disappeared from public view. How? A former company employee told me. Who? Emily glanced at Michael. Michael shook his head. I didn't tell her. Then who? Before Emily could answer, Michael's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. His expression changed. What? Daniel asked. Michael stood. We have another problem. How many problems are you keeping in that folder? This one isn't in the folder. He turned his phone around. A news headline filled the screen. Billionaire CEO Daniel Carter living secret life as Keke driver. Below it was a blurry photograph. Daniel standing beside Emily. The image had clearly been taken days earlier. Emily covered her mouth. Daniel read the next line. Questions surround Carter global leadership amid CEO's bizarre disappearance. Michael scrolled. Another photograph showed Daniel entering his rented room. Another showed Emily approaching his Keke. Another showed Sophie. Daniel's anger vanished. Something colder replaced it. Who photographed Sophie? Michael's jaw tightened. That is exactly why we need to move quickly. Daniel looked at Emily. For the first time since the market, her fear made complete sense. Not fear of being exposed. Fear that someone had been watching them. How long have you known? He asked her. I noticed the same gray sedan 3 days ago. Why didn't you tell me? I wasn't sure. You were afraid. Yes. Of what? Emily hesitated. Of the person who told me where to find you. Michael looked at her. Who? Emily took a breath. Richard Blake. The room became completely silent. Daniel knew the name. Everyone inside Carter Global knew the name. Richard Blake had been Daniel's father's closest business partner. He now served as chairman of the board. When Daniel's father died, Richard had guided Daniel through his first difficult year as chief executive. He called Daniel's son. He attended birthdays. He toasted Daniel's engagement to Vanessa. And 3 months earlier, when Daniel announced he was temporarily stepping away from public duties, Richard had supported him. Take all the time you need, Richard had said. I will protect the company. Daniel slowly looked at Michael. You didn't know. Michael's expression suggested something worse than surprise. I suspected Richard knew more about the old warehouse scandal than he ever admitted. Emily spoke quietly. He contacted me 6 months ago. Why? He said he wanted to help clear my father's name. Daniel almost smiled at the cruelty of it. And in return, he asked questions about the reserve. He believed my father had kept copies of documents. Did he? Emily nodded. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Where are they? I don't know. Emily, I truly don't know. Before my father passed away, he gave me a key and said one day I would understand what it opened. A key to what? I've spent years trying to find out. Michael moved closer. Do you still have it? Yes. Where? Emily looked at him. Somewhere safe. Daniel saw the slightest change in Michael's expression. So did Emily. For the first time, Daniel realized she did not fully trust Michael either. The thought disturbed him. That evening, Daniel did not return to the small room he had rented. Reporters had already surrounded the neighborhood. His experiment was over. His identity belonged to the public again. He returned to the mansion he had abandoned 3 months earlier. The gates opened. Security guards straightened. House staff greeted him. Everything was exactly as he remembered. And yet the mansion felt smaller. Daniel entered his bedroom and stared at rows of expensive clothes. He opened a drawer containing watches worth more than many houses. 3 months earlier they had represented success. Now they looked like objects. Nothing more. He sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time, he missed the squeaking ceiling fan. He missed waking before sunrise. He missed negotiating tiny fares with passengers. He even missed pushing the Keke when its engine refused to start. But most of all, he missed the simplicity of knowing exactly what people believed he was. Poor, ordinary, unimportant. Wealth complicated every expression. Every kindness came with a question. Every relationship carried doubt. His phone rang. Richard Blake. Daniel stared at the name. Then answered. Daniel. Richard sounded relieved. Thank goodness you're safe. Daniel almost laughed. Safe from what? The press is turning this into a circus. They usually do. I warned the board not to overreact. How generous. A pause. Richard noticed the tone. Is something wrong? Daniel stared through the window. Did you know where I was? Silence. Only for half a second. But Daniel heard it. Of course not. You're sure? Daniel, if I had known you were driving that ridiculous machine through Lagos traffic, I would have dragged you home myself. Daniel smiled without humor. There it was. A joke. A warm voice. The man who had helped bury his father. Or perhaps Daniel was becoming paranoid. Then Richard said something that erased the doubt. Besides, your little adventure gave you what you wanted. Daniel said nothing. You wanted to know whether someone could love you without your money. Richard chuckled. I suppose Miss Reed passed your test. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. He had never told Richard Emily's surname. Public reports had not published it. Not yet. How do you know her name? Silence. This time much longer. Daniel. Daniel ended the call. He immediately contacted Michael. Richard knows Emily's surname. I'll send security. Not to me. Daniel stood. To Emily. But Emily was no longer at her apartment. Neither was Sophie. For 2 hours Daniel called repeatedly. No answer. His security team checked nearby hospitals. Nothing. Then Daniel received a text message. It contained only an address and 4 words. Come alone, bring Michaels. Daniel stared at the screen. The contradiction was strange. Come alone. Bring Michael. It sounded almost deliberately wrong. He forwarded the message to Michael. Michael called immediately. Don't go. Why? Because whoever sent that message knows enough about both of us to control the situation. Daniel looked again at the words. Emily. If it were Emily, why tell you to bring me? Daniel had no answer. Then he remembered the key. Michael. Yes. What if the message isn't about Emily? What do you mean? What if somebody believes you know where the key lays? Michael became silent. Daniel's pulse changed. You do know. Daniel. You know what it opens. Michael exhaled slowly. Yes. Daniel closed his eyes. Another secret. Another person deciding which truths he could handle. What does it open? A private storage box your father created under a different name. And Emily's father had the key. Apparently. What's inside? If I'm correct, evidence. Against Richard. Yes. Daniel finally understood. The reserve. Emily. The surveillance. The photographs. Richard had not helped Emily because he cared about clearing Thomas Reed's name. He had been searching for the key. Daniel and Michael traveled with a security team positioned far behind them. The address led to an abandoned Carter freight warehouse near the industrial district. Daniel recognized the building. It had closed years ago. A rusting company logo still clung to the outer wall. They entered. Inside, Emily stood near a desk. Sophie was not with her. Daniel rushed forward. Where's Sophie? She's safe. I sent her to stay with someone I trust. Daniel stopped. You sent the message. Emily nodded. You could have answered your phone. I thought Richard was tracking it. Michael looked around. Why here? Because this was my father's warehouse. Daniel felt a strange heaviness. Emily walked toward an old office. My father brought me here once when I was little. She touched the doorway. I remember sitting right there while he finished paperwork. For a moment, her eyes seemed to travel backward through time. My father wasn't perfect. He forgot birthdays. He worked too much. He always smelled like engine oil when he came home. She smiled faintly. But he never stole anything. The smile disappeared. When Carter Freight accused him, I watched a man who had taught me that your name mattered more than money become ashamed to leave his house. Daniel lowered his eyes. I wish I had known. So do I. Emily removed a small key from a chain around her neck. Michael stared at it. My father told me one more thing, Emily said. What? Daniel asked. He said if the Carter family ever came looking for this key, I should ask them one question. Daniel waited. Emily looked directly at him. What did your father believe money was for? Daniel froze. A memory returned. He was 17 again. His father stood beside the garden fountain after their strange conversation about fortunes being built twice. Daniel had asked him why he gave so much money away. His father answered without hesitation. Money is a tool. If all it does is protect the person holding it, then it has made that person poorer. Daniel repeated the words. Emily's eyes filled with tears. That is what my father said you would answer. Michael looked stunned. Daniel suddenly understood why Thomas Reed had been trusted with the key. His father had not simply investigated him. He had believed him. Emily handed Daniel the key. Michael led them to an old metal cabinet bolted into a rear office. Behind it was a concealed compartment containing a small locked box. The key fit. Inside were documents, photographs, internal reports, bank statements, and a handwritten letter. Daniel recognized his father's handwriting immediately. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was addressed to him. Daniel did not read it aloud. He read slowly. His father explained that executives inside Carter Freight had created false claims and transferred losses onto warehouse workers. Richard Blake had approved payments through shell companies. When Daniel's father discovered the scheme, he quietly collected evidence while preparing legal action. But Richard had learned about the investigation. Before everything could be exposed, Daniel's father became ill during a trip. The letter did not accuse Richard of causing his death, but it warned Daniel never to confuse loyalty with familiarity. The final line hurt most. A man who always agrees with you may be protecting your ego instead of protecting you. Daniel folded the letter. All those dinners, all those holidays, all those years Richard had called him son. Michael began photographing the documents. We have enough here to reopen everything. Emily looked at Daniel. And clear my father's name. Yes, Daniel answered without hesitation. And every other employee who was blamed. A slow sound came from behind them. Clapping. Richard Blake stood in the doorway. Two men were beside him. Daniel's security team had not entered yet. Richard smiled. Your father always did enjoy dramatic gestures. Emily stepped backward. Daniel moved slightly in front of her. Richard noticed. So this is the famous love story. Leave her out of this. I tried. Richard looked at Emily. Your father was as stubborn as Daniel. Emily's voice shook, but she stood straight. My father was innocent. Yes. Richard's casual answer stunned everyone. Emily stared at him. You admit it. Of course he was innocent. Daniel felt disgust rise inside him. People lost everything. Richard shrugged. Companies survive because somebody absorbs the damage. That was your philosophy. It was business. Daniel thought of his father. Money is a tool. Two men. Two philosophies. One company caught between them. Richard stepped closer. You've spent 3 months pretending to be poor, Daniel. Perhaps poverty has made you sentimental. No. Daniel looked at Emily. It made me observant. Richard smiled. And what did you observe? That the people with the least often know exactly what things cost. Richard's smile faded. Daniel continued. You thought my father was weak because he cared about workers whose names you didn't remember. I built that company beside him and nearly destroyed what he wanted it to stand for. Richard's voice hardened. You think kindness runs a corporation? No. Daniel lifted the folder. But neither does corruption. Richard glanced toward the documents. Give me the box. Daniel shook his head. Richard's men stepped forward. Then footsteps thundered outside. Michael smiled. You really thought Daniel Carter traveled anywhere without security after his face appeared on every major news site today. Richard turned. Daniel's security team entered. The confrontation ended quickly. No dramatic fight. No heroic struggle. Just the sudden collapse of a man who had spent decades believing powerful people could control every room they entered. Richard was detained until authorities arrived. Over the following weeks, the story spread far beyond the strange headline about a billionaire Keke driver. Investigations reopened. Former employees were interviewed. Records were examined. The Carter Foundation Reserve finally served the purpose Daniel's father had intended. Wrongfully accused employees had their names cleared. Families received compensation. Thomas Reed's record was formally corrected. Emily cried when the official letter arrived. She placed it beside an old photograph of her father. Sophie stood beside her. "What does it mean?" Sophie asked. Emily wiped her tears. "It means people will know Grandpa told the truth." Sophie considered that. "But we already knew." Emily smiled. "Yes." She hugged her sister. "We did." For Daniel, however, one question remained. Emily had known who he was. That truth could not simply disappear. Several weeks after the investigation became public, Daniel asked her to meet him at the roadside where she had first entered his Keke. She arrived expecting one of his company cars. Instead, the faded yellow Keke was parked there. Emily laughed. "You kept it." Daniel leaned against it. "Best vehicle I've ever owned." "You own cars that cost more than apartment buildings." "None of them taught me anything." Emily walked closer. The atmosphere between them was warm but careful. Daniel looked at her. "I need to ask you something." "I know." "When you offered me your savings, did you already know who I was?" "Yes." Daniel nodded. "That still hurt. Why did you do it?" Emily looked down. "Because I stopped seeing Daniel Carter." He waited. "I knew your name before I met you. I knew the company. I knew the money. I knew what happened to my father." She looked up again. "But then I saw you give free rides to elderly passengers when you thought nobody noticed." Daniel said nothing. "I saw you buy food for that boy who sold water near the junction." "You saw that?" "Yes." "He looked hungry." "I know." Emily smiled faintly. "I saw you apologize to a passenger when you were wrong. Do you know how rare that is?" Daniel laughed. Emily became serious. "At first I watched you because I wanted evidence. Then I kept coming back because the person I found wasn't the person I expected." Daniel leaned against the Keke. "So you were testing me?" "Maybe." He smiled. "That's inconvenient." "You were testing me too." "Fair point." Then Emily's expression changed. "But I don't want a relationship built on tests." Daniel's smile faded. Neither did he. He had spent months believing he could manufacture certainty. Remove the wealth. Create poverty. Watch how people behaved. Then choose who deserved trust. But people were not experiments. Love was not a hidden camera test. Trust could not grow while one person secretly held the answer sheet. Daniel finally understood the flaw in his plan. Vanessa's betrayal had convinced him that wealth made honesty impossible. But the problem had never been the money itself. The problem was fear. He had been so afraid of being deceived again that he had become deceptive himself. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "For pretending." "For assuming I could test someone's character without revealing mine." Emily studied him. That sounded suspiciously mature. "Don't get used to it." She laughed. The familiar sound returned. Real. Unforced. Daniel felt something inside him settle. Months passed. Daniel returned fully to Carter Global, but he did not return as the same chief executive. Executive bonuses became tied partly to worker safety and retention. An independent ethics office was created. Employees could report misconduct outside their immediate management structure. Daniel established a program named after Thomas Reed to provide legal support for workers facing wrongful accusations. Michael once joked that driving a Keke had turned Daniel into a reformer. Daniel corrected him. No, listening did. He still occasionally drove the Keke. Not undercover. Everyone knew who he was now. The first time he returned to the roadside, passengers surrounded him with phones. Some wanted photographs. Some wanted free rides. One elderly woman entered, looked directly at him and said, "Are you actually going somewhere, or are you here to become famous again?" Daniel laughed so hard he nearly forgot to start the engine. Emily remained part of his life. Slowly, without tests, without secret identities, without pretending certainty existed where it didn't. One evening, almost a year after they had met, they sat outside the tiny building where Daniel had rented his room. The landlord had preserved the room exactly as Daniel left it, because journalists had repeatedly offered money to photograph it. Daniel shook his head when he learned that. People will monetize anything. Emily smiled. Says the billionaire. Well. The old ceiling fan still squeaked. Daniel looked upward. I used to hate that sound. And now, it reminds me that I could sleep without a 40-person security team. Emily laughed. Daniel became thoughtful. My father used to say some fortunes are built twice. You told me. I finally understand. Emily waited. The first fortune is what you own. He looked toward the street where children were playing. The second is what your ownership allows other people to become. Emily smiled. I think your father would have liked that. Daniel looked at her. I hope so. A motorcycle passed outside. The city continued moving. Daniel thought about Vanessa. For the first time, the memory carried no anger. Her betrayal had wounded him, but he no longer wanted that wound to control every future decision. Some people loved money. Some people feared it. Some people worshipped it. Some people used it. Money did not automatically reveal character. Choices did. Emily had approached him with secrets. Daniel had approached her with secrets too. Neither had been completely honest. Yet when the consequences became real, Emily chose to expose the truth about her father without trying to profit from Daniel's wealth. And Daniel chose to repair harm his company had caused, even though doing so threatened its reputation. Perhaps true love was not about finding someone who entered your life perfectly. Perhaps it was about discovering what someone chose when truth became expensive. Daniel's phone buzzed. A message from Michael. The final settlement involving the warehouse families had been approved. Daniel showed Emily. She stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she smiled. My mother would have loved to see this. Daniel knew Emily's mother had passed away several years earlier. She knew your father was innocent. Yes. She knew you never gave up either. Emily looked away, emotional. Daniel did not fill the silence. He had learned something else during those months as a driver. Not every silence needed rescuing. Sometimes being present was enough. Later that evening, Daniel drove Emily home in the Keke. Halfway there, rain began falling. Emily looked at the water splashing through the open side. "You have got to be kidding me." Daniel laughed. "What? The first time I entered this thing, it was raining. I remember. I couldn't afford the fare. You still owe me." Emily stared at him. "Daniel Carter, you are worth billions. A debt is a debt." She laughed. "How much?" Daniel pretended to calculate. "With interest. Don't push your luck." He smiled. "Forget the money. Then what do you want?" Daniel looked ahead at the wet road. "Keep telling me when my jokes are terrible." Emily sighed dramatically. "That sounds like a lifetime job." Daniel laughed. Traffic slowed. Rain tapped against the Keke. And somewhere between the crowded road, the faded yellow paint, and the woman who had known his name before she knew his heart, Daniel realized the strange experiment had given him something far more valuable than the answer he originally wanted. He had gone looking for a woman who would love him without his wealth. Instead, he learned that he first needed to become a man who could trust without controlling every condition. He had disguised himself to discover other people's character. But the greatest character revealed had been his own. Not because he was perfect. Because he finally saw the parts of himself that money had allowed him to hide. His fear, his suspicion, his pride, and his belief that he could protect himself from pain by controlling the truth. Emily had her own mistakes. She had entered his life looking for answers while concealing what she knew. Yet in the end, neither person's secret mattered as much as what they chose after those secrets were exposed. That was the lesson Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. True love was not proven by poverty. It was not proven by wealth. It was not proven by dramatic tests. It was proven in ordinary moments when someone had the opportunity to use another person and chose not to. It was proven when Emily offered her savings to a man she believed might be testing her, not because she wanted his fortune, but because she had watched him show kindness. It was proven when Daniel used the truth about his father's company not to protect his family's reputation, but to restore the reputations of people who had been forgotten. It was proven when two imperfect people stopped testing each other and started telling each other the truth. Years later, employees inside Carter Global would still tell the story of the billionaire who vanished from his mansion and became a Keke driver. Some believed it was brilliant. Others thought it was ridiculous. Daniel agreed with both groups. But whenever someone asked whether the experiment helped him find true love, he always smiled before answering. No. The person asking would usually look confused. Then Daniel would continue. It taught me how to recognize it. And that difference meant everything. Because wealth had once convinced Daniel that everybody wanted something from him. Poverty taught him that everybody needed something. Respect, dignity, understanding, opportunity, forgiveness, sometimes money, and sometimes simply the chance to be seen as more than the position society had assigned them. Daniel had once believed the greatest danger of being rich was attracting people who loved his wealth. He eventually learned there was another danger. Becoming so suspicious that he failed to recognize genuine people when they finally appeared. That almost happened with Emily. If Michael had arrived at the market minutes earlier, perhaps Daniel would have walked away in anger. If Emily had allowed fear to keep her silent, perhaps Richard's secret would have remained buried. If Daniel had chosen to protect the Carter name instead of exposing wrongdoing, perhaps hundreds of families would never have received justice. Their lives had turned on decisions that seemed small in the moment. A free Keke ride. A hidden key. An old letter. A woman refusing to abandon her father's name. A billionaire finally questioning the people who always agreed with him. And a faded yellow Keke that became the unlikely place where two people discovered that the truth they feared most was the truth they needed. The vehicle Daniel, originally bought to hide his identity, eventually stood inside the lobby of the Thomas Reed Community Center, which the Carter Foundation opened several years later. A small plaque was placed beside it. Visitors expected Daniel's name to appear. It didn't. Instead, the plaque contained the words his father had once spoken. Money is a tool. What matters is what you allow it to build. Whenever Daniel visited the center, he noticed people stopping beside the Keke. Children climbed near it until staff members chased them away. Parents took photographs. Former Carter Freight employees sometimes stood quietly in front of the plaque. Emily's favorite photograph was taken there. Sophie, now older, stood beside the Keke, holding the official document that cleared her father's name. Emily stood beside her. Daniel stood several steps away. Not at the center. Not in front. Just part of the picture. Exactly where he wanted to be. Because for most of his life, wealth had placed Daniel at the center of every room. The Keke taught him that some of life's most important things become visible only when you stop insisting on being the most important person in the story. And perhaps that was the unthinkable thing that happened when a billionaire pretended to be poor. He thought he was searching for someone worthy of his love. Instead, he discovered the kind of man he needed to become before he could truly give it. Dear viewers, if you believe true love should never be determined by the size of someone's bank account, the clothes they wear, the vehicle they drive, or the social class people place them in, then let Daniel and Emily's story remind you of something important. Character often reveals itself most clearly when there appears to be nothing to gain. Would you have forgiven Emily after discovering that she knew Daniel's identity from the beginning? Do you think Daniel was right to pretend to be poor in order to search for genuine love, or did his test cross a line because he was also hiding the truth? And if you suddenly discovered that someone you loved was secretly wealthy or secretly testing your character, would that change the way you felt about them? Most importantly, if you were Daniel, would you have exposed your own family's company to clear the names of innocent workers, even if doing so could damage everything your family had built? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your answer may reveal more about the meaning of loyalty, trust, and genuine love than you realize. And if you support the message that people deserve to be valued for their character rather than their money, kindly subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more powerful stories filled with unexpected secrets, difficult choices, emotional twists, and lessons that may change the way you see the people around you. Your subscription tells us that stories about kindness, integrity, justice, and genuine human connection still matter. Until the next story, remember this. Never underestimate someone because they appear to have little. And never automatically trust someone simply because they appear to have everything.